This is a version of a talk given at the second People and Plants workshop at National Museums Scotland on the 7th of November 2022 and is written by Ali Clark from National Museums Scotland and Alistair Paterson from the University of Western Australia. In this talk, we're looking at Emile Clement and the collections that he brought together from northwest Western Australia. In order to understand the history behind these collections, we need to map the man, his background, and his collecting. Emile Louis Bruno Clement was a collector whose practice was driven largely by the commercial value of his collections. Clement mainly collected from northwest Australia between 1896 and 1928, both in person and through intermediates. He collected a vast amount of ethnographic material and, to a lesser extent, natural history from the Pilbara and the Kimberley, and also to some extent from the Pacific Islands, although he didn't go there himself. These collections were sold to a vast network of museums and remain dispersed across these both in Europe and North America today, including the National Museum of Ireland, National Museum Scotland, the British Museum, a variety of museums in Germany, the Volkerkunde in Leiden in the Netherlands, museums in Russia, and in Switzerland as well. And Clement's material formed the majority of Australian ethnography within these museums and was used by them to represent Indigenous Australian material culture more generally. Whilst there are obvious pitfalls to focusing on a single collector, Clement is a special case given the sheer amount of material he collected, the large number of museums in which the material was exhibited, and the fact that for many people their encounter with Australian Aboriginal material culture was, in many cases for the first time, through the lens of collecting that was Clement's. Clement was living and working on Ngalama Injibanji country, and he collected during his work there, setting up gold mines at Truanna and near Roeben in the Pilbara. He made 3 trips to the northwest of Western Australia, the first in 1895, the second 1896 to 1898, and the third 1899 to 1900. He was assisted by his son, Adolphe Clement, and after 1910, it appears that he was sent material from resident settlers across the northwest, probably through the hub of Roeben. Clement wasn't a trained anthropologist, however, he appears to have attempted to learn some of the Aboriginal languages in the areas that he worked in, and he observed cultural practices. This was driven by the demands of the museums who purchased his collections. In 1899, he published Vocabulary of the Ngalama tribe inhabiting the plains between the Yule and Fortescue rivers, showing maps of 8 Pilbara language groups. He then published ethnographical notes on the Western Australian Aborigines, accompanied by a catalogue. The notes were published in Leiden, where the Volkerkunde had also purchased objects from Clement. His basic understanding of the organisation of Aboriginal social life was exposed by Radcliffe Brown, who criticised Clement's confusion between various groups and tribal names. Clement's collections are holistic snapshots of Indigenous life in the northwest of Western Australia that demonstrate the relationship between people, the land, and culture, encompassing natural history and anthropology collections. They provide, to quote Ian Coates, a package collection. They were displayed to represent Aboriginal Australia, either in geographic displays or typological displays, such as this one at the Pitt Rivers Museum. In 1898, J.J. Buckley of the National Museum of Ireland noted that, quote, the collection of Australian ethnographic specimens sent on approval by Clement is very interesting, the uses of different objects being given, as well as the native names and, in most instances, the localities, end quote. The National Museum of Ireland went on to purchase 62 jars containing seeds, plants, and ochre from Clement, as well as details of local names and preferred uses, such as for food or making objects. Clement was collecting from Aboriginal people who in their own lifetimes had lost access to their traditional country, having been invaded by settlers without their invitation or consent in the early 1860s. Across the new colonial frontier, Aboriginal men, women, and children provided labour to sheep pastoralists and pearlers and were bound to the settlers by the Master and Servant Act. Traditional food hunting was now a potential crime, as was free travel through country away from the newly defined sheep stations. Clement arrived in a contested world and clearly admired both the white population as well as having a keen interest in Aboriginal life. We don't know much about how Clement acquired the collections, but it appears likely that Aboriginal people were aware of his demand for material and that many of the items were provided in exchange. And the standard frontier exchange was tobacco, sugar, tea, flour, and clothes. But more work is needed in this respect to understand these relationships. When he wrote to museums to offer collections, Clement also provided detailed notes, drawings, and photographs. He clearly understood that provenance was important to museums and aimed to provide as much detail to authenticate himself and these collections as possible. Whilst he had an interest in Aboriginal culture, the purpose of his efforts were clearly economic, and he's been described as an entrepreneurial collector. The correspondence shown on the slide is typical for Clement and shows the cost of items to the right, whilst the red denotes which items the museum intended to purchase. Out of the 1,600 objects from Australia and the Pacific that Clement sold to museums throughout Europe, 185 objects from Western Australia were sold to the Edinburgh Museum of Science and Art, later the Royal Scottish Museum, Edinburgh, today what we now know as National Museum Scotland. The collections were sold in 4 lots. First in 1896, next in 1898, and then later in 1923 and 1925. And it was the 1898 sale that specifically separated out botanical material, with 42 plant specimens sold, ranging from plants eaten to spinifex used for baskets to wood used for shields. The 1898 sale was divided in the register, with the first 74 objects described as an ethnological collection from northwest Australia, despite it including spinifex gum, Kuladi gum, red and yellow ochres, and black pigments. The remaining 42 objects were described as a collection of economic botany from northwest Australia, comprising of native foods, woods used in making weapons, and herbarium specimens. And from the listing provided in the register, we can assume that the collection mirrored that found today in the economic botany collection at Kew, with many plants listed found in the Kew collection today. Whilst 154 objects remain in the collections of National Museum Scotland, 153 sold directly from Clement to the Edinburgh Museum of Science and Art and the Royal Scottish Museum, and 1 further object, a pearl shell ornament, which was transferred from the Wellcome Historical Museum to the Royal Scottish Museum in 1953. We know that Clement already had a relationship with the Edinburgh Museum of Science and Art, having sold European archaeological material to the museum in 1887. His archaeological sales went to the National Museums in Dublin, Edinburgh, and Cardiff, as well as the British Museum and the Ashmolean Museum, creating a reputation and a network for himself. And it was these museums that he initially approached, having Indigenous Australian collections to sell in 1896 and 1898. Using these networks to further his reach across the UK and Europe. When the initial sales of Clement material arrived at the museum in Edinburgh, they would have been held by the Art and Industrial section of the museum. In 1901, this department split to form the Technological Department and the Art and Ethnographical Department. From the mid-19th to the early 20th century, the Edinburgh Museum of Science and Art purchased, amongst other things, many collections comprised of ethnography and botany. Science, art, and industry were presented together in the museum, and the lines between these distinctions were blurry. Botanical specimens were collected both as economic botany and ethnobotany, with the former presented as the raw materials of industry, whilst economic botany is the useful application of plants for industry and was thus of great interest to empire. Ethnobotany describes the relationship between people and plants, their symbolic as well as practical value. This constant shuffling of collections and division into Western taxonomies meant that ultimately the economic botany collections remained within science and technology, whilst ethnobotanical material resided within ethnography or world cultures. However, in 1938, there was a large-scale transfer out of all collections labelled botany in the museum to the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh. Within an ethnographic or technological context, these collections were too botanical and belonged to the natural sciences, so they moved to what was perceived as a better home for them, the Botanic Garden in Edinburgh. However, in the late 1950s, these were then all disposed of due to their lack of value to the gardens. In a botanical context, they were perceived as too ethnographic. However, for reasons unknown, not all of the botanical material was sent to the garden in Edinburgh, and some remains at NMS today. The collections that remain at National Museum Scotland are housed in the Department of Global Arts, Cultures and Design, and are important snapshots of the value of plants to their originating communities, acting as material archives of Indigenous ecological knowledge. So most of our work has been on the material sold to NMS by Clement, has focused on the Ngalama or Yindjibarndi material. And this is because out of the 154 objects sold by Clement, or that remains in the museum, we know that 119 were taken from Ngalama and Yindjibarndi country. So where did these collections come from? This is just a short video to give you a sense of the Pilbara and what it looks like. So in October 2022, we travelled to Roeburn to work with Ngalama and Yindjibarndi people to map Clement collecting sites on country. Along with the photographs and written documents provided by Clement, he also affixed detailed labels to the materials he was selling. So these labels often contain Clement's interpretation of the local Aboriginal names for the objects, their use, and the materials they are made from. Sometimes the labels also record a place of collection, and sometimes this is recorded in his written archives. In other cases, we may be able to think about where the items came from. For example, shells will have to be coastal, certain plants have specific locations. And so the exercise that we've done is kind of bringing these dispersed collections back together and placing them within country. And this is based on a lot of the documentation. So this photograph is a historic image taken, we're not sure whether it's taken by Clement or an associate of him, but it's taken at Inthanuna, and this is the site here. And also, whilst we were at Inthanuna, Kerry Ann Churnside, who we were working with, described how she'd seen in the images of the collections at NMS these bulbs of riverweed or nutgrass, and showed us the place where they grow today. Tauranga, which was the mine site, which was run by Clement, he collected a lot of spinifex from around there in its varying forms. And this is an example of one of the collections held at Kew today. So it shows kind of spinifex, how it's been turned into string. Also at Tauranga, we were shown the bush coconut or the bloodwood apple, which still grows on site, and for which they have collections of it in the economic botany collection at Kew. And Bala Bala, which is a fishing site, we visited there, and this necklace, which is held by National Museum Scotland, is recorded as having been made there. And you can see kind of its placement in the landscape. It's made of dentalium shells. So what next? We're working with the Ngalama Yindjibarndi Foundation on the development of follow-on projects, and have started a mini one that looks at locating historic ochre collection sites by considering where the ochre may have come from before being provided to Clement. So Clement sold a number of these jars of ochre to a wide variety of museums, so quite a few museums hold these today. And Bala Bala, which I've mentioned already, which we visited, is a talu or increase site for the white cockatoo. It's also a historic ochre collection site. So with permission from the traditional owners, we collected some ochre to take back to the University of Western Australia. Samples are also being taken from these historic jars of ochre held by National Museum Scotland, and it's hoped that XRF analysis will be able to reveal geographic markers both of the historic ochre and the contemporary ochre, to think about where these historic ochres were being collected and what that says about ochre collection sites today. As we said at the start, these collections are about the relationship between people, the land, and culture. Museums' need to categorise and divide has isolated these collections from their country, culture, and meaning. Reuniting the dispersed collections with their communities enables an informed understanding of how these collections function as part of a wider cultural framework. And this work is very much ongoing. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Ngalama Yindjibarndi country, and the senior cultural leaders who we've been working with on this project. Thank you.